Hello? Shout out in the chat if you're here and you can hear and see me. Please and thank you. I am going to tweet out that we're here so that folks can see that we're here. And hello, hello, hello. Hello. Is anybody there? Wow, that's like not at all what that song sounds like, but deal with it. I'm doing my best. Okay, just retweeted that. It's so hot here, y'all. I don't think, based on what the levels look like, that you can hear my fan going, but it is blowing on my little body and it's doing the best it can because it's so hot here. And I had to close the window because it is loud outside sometimes. Is anybody in there? We're going to probably start at 4:05. But if people would like to say hello in the chat, I wouldn't say no to that. My hair is very big, but I was gonna say I could read some poetry while we waited, but I don't think I own books of poetry. I know I own poetry. I just don't know where it's. Oh, it might be in that bag. I have so many books. Such a problem. Hi, Rourke. How are you? I like how my voice gets so much louder when I know that there are people in the chat who are like potentially going to talk to me. Oh, it's so hot. It's so hot. We're waiting work until like 4:05 just to give folks a chance to get here. Recite from memory. I'm a nobody. Who are you? Are you a nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd banish us, you know. How I long to be a somebody. Something about a frog. To sit and live the livelong day to an admiring bog. That is, I think, Dickinson. And that would be the only poem I know, period. Yeah, the heat is killing me. It is, let's see, according to my phone, it is 93 degrees right now in beautiful Meeples, and that is too hot for my life. And it's supposed to be 98 on Monday, and this is horrible. So, that's bad. Thank you, Rourke. Thank you for applauding the one poem that I have memorized that I could say off the cuff. I'm literally like, I'm looking at my bookshelves because I'm trying to figure out if I own a single book of poetry on these shelves. And I don't think I do, which I should work on because everyone should read poetry. Oh, the Google Calendar work is a product of I also can't schedule anything and don't know whenever things are happening in my life because I just don't know anything. It takes about, I think we're up to like 5 separate products that tell me when, like, keep track of my to-dos and my appointments, and that is the only way I can do anything. So, yeah, you're welcome, but it's really for me, and I'm glad it works for you too. I think we're going to get started, so that's going to be exciting. Today we're talking about reading queerly, or how to make everything queer and annoy all of your straight friends. I mean, I hope my straight friends aren't annoyed by me. I think at this point they're just like, this is who you are. But I think it's actually also no surprise to folks who know me that I'm doing this episode. I think it, you know, I did an episode of Get Hype with Ali Grauer and Mal Fox about doing trans and queer headcanons, and we had a really nice conversation. And in some ways, the conversation we're going to have today is related to that, but it's also different, because I think that the man whose work we're going to talk about, Alexander Doty, who like really fundamentally shaped the way that I see, hey, Brooke, I have more straight friends than that, theoretically, but yes. But I think Alex Doty would have a lot to say about the way that I talked about my reading practices in that episode, and I think upon revisiting this work of his that I read for today, and I'm going to talk to you about, I also have to like rethink what I said, not because what I said was wrong at the time, but because I think the ways that I said it made it a lot easier to sort of dismiss what I'm saying, in the way that Doty takes a really hard line that I'm really impressed with and love and am excited by. So I'm really excited to share this book with you that I read. The book, for the record, is Flaming Classics, Queering the Film Canon, by Alexander Doty. It's backwards for me, so I'm like, ugh. But it is a pretty short book. It's 198 pages total, not including index. And it's a book that came to me, or I became aware of, my junior year of college, I think, my junior year of undergrad, through a friend of mine, a really good friend of mine who works in film studies, who does film studies and studies queer film and queer readings of film in particular. And this sounds weird for people who know me, but I didn't really get into queer readings until I read this book. And you're like, queer readings are a definitional part of who you are now. How can that be true? And like, I guess I dabbled in like queer readings, and I did some of it before I read this book and before I encountered this book, but I didn't pursue it the same way. I didn't pursue it with the kind of politics until I read this book. And so this book was really foundational for me, and I hope that talking about it today can get folks interested in the practice of queer readings, and also maybe interest folks in the book itself. It's such a good book. There are so many moments where I'm like, yeah, or I'm really excited about something, or I'm like, this is bizarre, but also really interesting. So yeah, I want to talk for a second about who Alexander Doty was, because he is unfortunately no longer with us. He was a professor who studied GLBT and feminist film theory. I say GLBT, I shortened it from some bio I was reading. So he's studied queer film theory and feminist film theory. Rourke, we're going to get to that when we talk about queer, what queer means in this context. But that's a really great question about if it's true that any reading done by a queer person is in some way a queer reading. Because the short answer is yeah, which is very exciting. But anyway, Doty got his PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana in English and Film Studies in 1984. Weirdly enough, it's not at Urbana-Champaign, and I don't know the politics behind that, but people who are more familiar with the University of Illinois system can maybe explain that one for us. Sorry, I'm going to be drinking on this stream because it is 93 fucking degrees here, so deal with it. Sorry. He worked at Lehigh University for quite a while, which is where he was when he wrote this book. He also worked at the end of his career, at the end of his life, he worked at Indiana University in Bloomington. He wrote, in addition to this, hi Rourke's cat, hi Gerda. In addition to this book, he also wrote a book called Making Things Perfectly Queer, and another book, he co-edited a book called Out in Culture, Gay, Lesbian, and Queer Essays on Popular Culture. So he works, he does a lot of work in sort of what we would term and what he calls mainstream popular culture, which is not sort of avant-garde film or sort of like queer culture as we understand it to be queer culture created by queer people for consumption purely by queer people or with queer people as a primary audience. He works in a sort of more mainstream world. And he died, unfortunately, after a car accident in 2012, so he is no longer with us, but he has had a huge influence on me personally, has had a huge influence on other scholars. I can't remember, Just Queer Folks is the name of the book. The author, whose name I think is Colin, and the book is somewhere behind me, behind the flag, I think, probably. He had an influence on him, so he's touched a ton of people. And this book is, I think, a really good example of how and why he's mattered so much, at least in my life. So, queer readings, what are they? Rourke asked a question about if a queer reading, any reading done by a queer person is somehow queer. And the short answer is kind of. And I think to better answer the question of what constitutes a queer reading, I'm going to be quoting a lot from this book because I think that he says things better than I can summarize him saying them. So sorry in advance for just this being like a reading podcast, if it's a podcast, whatever this thing is. But he talks about his definitions of queer, and he has 6 of them. So I'm going to read those to you, hopefully. So queerness has been used, according to him, as a synonym for either gay or lesbian or bisexual. Number 2, in various ways as an umbrella term, A, to pull together lesbian and or gay and or bisexual with little or no attention to differences, similar to uses of gay to mean lesbians, gay men, and sometimes bisexuals, transsexuals, and transgendered people. For the record, this book was written in 2000, so if we run across language like transgendered, which is not in use anymore, it was 2000, which means he probably wrote this book in like 1998, and times were different then, and he probably would have updated his language if he were alive today. It's also used to describe a range of distinct non-straight positions being juxtaposed with each other. C, to suggest those overlapping areas between and among lesbian and or gay and or bisexual and other non-straight persons. Point 3 is to describe the non-straight work, positions, pleasures, and readings of people who don't share the same sexual orientation as the text they are producing or responding to. For example, a straight scholar might be said to do queer work when she writes an essay on Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho, or someone gay might take queer pleasure in the lesbian film Desert Hurts. So, yeah, if you approach a text, Rourke, as a queer person and you're reading a text that is straight, you're doing a queer reading regardless of whether or not what you say. Point 4 is to describe any non-normative expression of gender, including those connected with straightness. 5, to describe non-straight things that are not clearly marked as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, or transgendered, but that seem to suggest or allude to one or more of these categories, often in a vague, confusing, or incoherent manner, which is really interesting and fun. The incoherency of queer is, I think, something that's really fun, and he does a really interesting thing with later. And number 6 is to describe those aspects of spectatorship, cultural readership, production, and textual coding that seem to establish spaces not described by or contained within straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, or transgendered understandings and categorizations of gender and sexuality. This is a far more radical understanding of queer, as queerness here is something apart from established gender and sexuality categories, not the result of vague or confusing coding or positioning. So what all of those are functioning as queer in this text. So things that it can be sort of umbrella-ly queer, although he actually strays away from doing that, which is really interesting. Reading queerly for him is about reading against, really in this book, it's about reading against heterocentrism. And what is heterocentrism? What does that mean? Heterocentrism in this book is sort of identified by an understanding of that everyone is straight until proven otherwise. In history, sometimes we call it the smoking dick. Or maybe I just made that up and then I say that. But I call it dick, which is you have to have proof of genital contact, is what it's really, I think, known as, is proof of genital contact. So unless you have a cis male character kiss another cis male character, those characters can't be queer. They can't be conceived of as queer. They can't be gay. And it doesn't matter if in the text of the film they don't speak at all of having a partner or being in a heterosexual relationship or declaring I am straight. So long as they are not declared officially queer, right, they're straight. We read them as straight. We're trained to read them as straight. That's heterocentrism. And Doty says, that's fake and boring, which is also something I say. So you can already see the ways in which, right, that this is appearing to be a wild book and one that has been really influential to me. And Doty, I think, takes a harder line. One of the things he says, which is so, I'm like, hell yeah. This is on page 2 of the book, so he gets really into it. He says, I don't see queer readings as any less there or any less real than straight readings of classic or otherwise, quote, mainstream texts. I don't think that what I do in this book is colluding with dominant representational or interpretive regimes that seek to make queerness, quote, alternative or, quote, sub-straight. Yeah, Rourke, exactly. He's making a lot of room. He talks about the Blair Witch Project, where one of the characters mentions that he's a man and he has a girlfriend, and Doty says, so you could read that as straight, or you could read it as bisexual, so suck it, straight people. That's not what he says. That's me adding in. Doty is way less aggressive about the centrality of queer readings than I would be. And I think that's for a lot of reasons, one of which is he's not interested in establishing a more true or more correct reading. He's not saying these queer readings are more true than straight readings, except in the case of The Wizard of Oz, which we will talk about. I love The Wizard of Oz. But he is more interested, I think, and maybe this is the time he was in, maybe it's how he truly felt and truly believed. He's not interested in saying this queer reading is more true than this straight reading. He's interested in saying these queer readings are equally as valid as these straight readings. And I think that's a really interesting and important position to take, because it proves ultimately, I think, how entrenched we are in heterosexuality ultimately. Because he's not saying it's better. He's saying it's the same. And the amount of pushback that he writes that he receives as he does these readings is so immense. And all he's doing is saying we're the same. And that they're equally valid. And yeah, I have a lot of complicated feelings about this. I don't agree with Doty 100%. I think I am a person who tends to push it to the extremes, right? And so I'm like, oh no, my canon queer reading is this. And that is a product of who I am and where I've come from. The amount of pushback that I've received about queer readings, or trans readings in particular. I've been accused of misgendering a character, as if it matters that I've misgendered a fictional character by saying that they're a trans girl instead of a cis boy, because that's how I read them. I don't know what to tell you. my readings are right. No, that's where I've developed, and he's developed in a different sense, and that's really interesting and cool. Yeah, Rourke, the concept of canon is really interesting. I know there was just an episode of Never Tell Me the Pods where Alex Roberts Wright went on and talked about canon as it relates to sort of a biblical sense. And I think canon, for me, right, this idea of a one true reading is something that I don't agree with either, because I don't believe in competing queer theories. I don't believe in competing queer readings. I think that if you want to read a character as straight, that's cool. If you want to read them as bi, that's totally cool. If you want to read them as straight, I guess that's your prerogative. But that, for me, right, that is more rooted in understanding practices of labels being tenuous and not neat and messy. Yeah, Rourke, as a former Catholic and a history person, that episode is really interesting because I think that our understandings of canon, of historical canon, are, I think if we can move that to a public understanding of history as something that is messy and contested and not set in stone or held to a capital T truth, is really interesting. But maybe we'll talk about that later. So yeah, this book really seeks to disrupt heterocentrism and to disrupt what I call the smoking dick, disrupt the proof of genital contact. That and Donay has something to say about that as well, because there's also a way of understanding the centrality of sexuality in queer culture and in queer readings and in queer history. The proof of smoking dick you don't need, but to then say, right, that sexuality is not important to queer identity, I think is not true for the lived experiences of many, many queer people. I have a lot of personal hashtag opinions about the way that, like, lesbianism is often circulated as this weird asexual thing, where, and a lot of it, we're going to talk about this when we talk about, what was I just reading that I want to talk about? I don't know. But anyway, right, very rarely do we see expressions of lesbianism popularly that have to do with sexual desire, right? Like, and this is true, I mean, it's less true now with gay men, but it used to be true that in classic films, the sort of queer coded character, queer coding meaning you use cultural signs that are usually legible to straight people, not cultural signs that are within community, but are legible to others, to signal to an audience that this character is queer. Often that, almost exclusively, that happens with gay men. And those characters were often made asexual to make them less of a threat to audiences and to make them more usable by a straight narrative. So often these sort of queer-coded gay male characters are used to forward a plot. If they're not villains, which is a whole other deal, they're used to push a heterosexual plot, to be a friend to a straight woman. Yeah, Rourke, villains are a whole other category that we could talk about. But their queerness is desexualized to make them more useful to straight people, which is a bunch of garbage, because people's sexualities are important to them, are important to their lives, but, right, it's a catch-22, because on the one hand you have the desexualized queer character, on the other hand you have the need for the demand for genital contact, the need for the smoking dick. And how do you hold both of these at the same time? And so Donay does something really interesting where he notes that, this is all in the introduction, where is the introduction? Is this it? No. Oh, I hope I have it marked. He talks about basically that for him, the erotics is interesting, but it's not the full piece. It's not going to be necessary. Oh yeah, here he goes. This is in the introduction again. That we, what do you consider, namely, what do you consider to be an expression of queer sexuality or eroticism in life and in representation? I understand that the social and political arguments for the view held by a number of queers that only those representations that say the words or show the sexual acts can be considered truly lesbian, gay, or bisexual. After all, it still takes the most graphic sounds and sights to get many people, straight and queer, to consciously or willingly recognize as queer what they see or hear in the mainstream. But we know that human sexuality and erotic situations are not always expressed so obviously or clearly. In recognizing a wide range of representational codes and reading practices as queer, I am not attempting to take the sexual aspects out of lesbianism, gayness, or bisexuality. So what he's basically saying is asexuality is a whole other boat that we can talk about the way it's only used as a dismissal or lack of something rather than a valid sexual orientation or identity. But for Doty, right, queer here does not just mean genital contact or mouth genital contact or anything. It's not rooted solely in sex act, but it's not dismissive of sex act. It's just sort of working with what we have, right? Because in the films, the movies that Doty is talking about in these films, these movies that he's talking about in this book, wow, not these films, I wish he made a film, are ones where that would never happen. He's not it's not about, often there's no, like, open heterosexual contact, so the movies he talks about are The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, The Wizard of Oz, The Women, The Red Shoes, is it Some Like It Hot or Gentlemen Prefer Blondes? Because I get those two confused. I think it's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. But, I'm not a film scholar. It's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. And then the last one is Psycho. So, Rourke, I think you would be surprised at the number of straight men who are resistant to that reading of The Matrix as being a queer movie. Yeah, Rourke, I've only seen 2 of these films, so not having seen them is not that big a deal. Because, again, I think actually for this, what I want to talk about less is the readings of the movies, although if we have time at the end, I would love to talk about the Wizard of Oz reading, because it's wild, but so much fun. But I want to talk more about the skills that his readings enable us to have. Yeah, his reading of Psycho is purposefully refuses to engage in sort of label making or name calling. He uses queer in that way to sort of, I think it's in like definition 6, where he uses it to eclipse bi or gay or straight readings, to just talk about the unsettlement that he has. It's super interesting. It's super good. But yeah, so I want to talk briefly about some of the practices that are used in, that he uses to talk about film and the ways that he approaches these, because I think one of the things that strikes me about this is he's not just saying these characters are gay, and which is, I think, a totally valid way of going about these things. But he's a film scholar, right? So his analytical readings do a few things differently. I wanted to say more, but I think that is a value way of talking about it that I'm not interested in doing. So the first one to me that is so important that we did talk about already is decentering heterocentrism in our approaching of texts. And that's text, film as text, which is that controversial? I study history normally, so like my forays into things like this, I have no real rooting in reading film like that. So I just say things, and if you're like, that's a hugely contested thing in the field, not my field, just giving you what I have. So anyway, decentering heterocentrism, I think, is such an important first step, and that, I think, is something I approached in the episode of Get Hype that I was on that I would super highlight here, is the minute you stop assuming that every person that isn't explicitly queer is straight is a life-changing minute. It's really, really interesting. And it just changes your whole world. It blows everything up. And it's so much fun. So I strongly recommend you pick that up, even if you're not actually that interested in doing queer readings. Yeah, where a guy took a history, I took a class on German film from the Weimar period through just before World War II. So I have some history of German film, but not regular film. The second step for his queer readings are sort of knowing these pieces that are the queer cultural knowledges that he highlights. So one of them is something that I think is really interesting to talk about, which is age gaps. Age gaps are something that, and maybe I'll do an episode on Man-Boy Love, we'll see. Maybe, I feel like if I did an episode on Man-Boy Love, I would get kicked off of Twitch, so we probably won't do that. But maybe, who knows. But age gaps are a function of queer culture that we don't acknowledge or don't talk about very often, or if we do, we talk about them in sort of a Greek sense, as a sort of past, so the pederastic relationships that happened between older men and younger boys. But age gaps, like older man, young man pairings happen across queer history for gay men. Mother figures in lesbianism. Yeah, maybe I'll just do it in a Twitter thread, because Lord only knows, Twitter already knows I talk about Man-Boy Love. Mother figures in lesbianism are really interesting. It comes up again and again. I'm actually reading this very interesting book. It's interesting. Right now about lesbian. The author is calling it lesbian. I can trouble that term all I want, but that's the language she's using. Lesbian relationship in the early 19th century. I think that one of the women dies in 1850. And talking about motherhood and the relationship of mother and wife, and all of that is really interesting. So knowing those kinds of queer signs, right, it requires some knowledge of history to do the kinds of queer readings that Dodie is asking you to do. Yeah, it's interesting work. The age gap thing is true and real, and I have some ambivalences about it. I see the sort of cries about how critical folks are of it, and to some extent I agree, but I think also there are ways in which, yeah, it's complicated is where I'm going to put that one, and we will wash our hands of it and maybe talk about it later. But I also want to talk about queer eroticisms, because queer eroticisms are really wild in that, I think I said this on Twitter, friendship is queer. Friendship's super gay, and I think that's why men don't have good friends. But particularly thinking, right, if we have the understanding that men and women can't be friends because they are, like, if you're gonna buy into Harry Met Sally, which I don't, I think that's a bunch of fucking bullshit, but whatever. Friendship is an erotic space. It's a homo-social space, and it is therefore sort of homoerotic. In talking about certain kinds of movies, there is it's like the buddy film where one of them gets married, or this is talking specifically about Gentlemen Like Blondes, which is two women who are very, very close friends, and they find men, but their relationship is primary in their lives, and is primary in the film. And so reading these friendship spaces as simultaneously having a kind of erotics. Not erotic in the way that we might understand wholly sexually, or in the way that, like, eroticism is this very weird concept that I don't have a definition for right now, but is one which involves certain levels of intimacy and tension that really pushes the boundaries of what constitutes a sort of non-erotic relationship, if that makes any sense. If it doesn't, I'll work on finding a better definition for erotics. I'll look in probably performance studies. I assume they have something great to say about erotics. So thinking about queer erotics when doing queer readings is, I think, something that's really interesting, because it asks us to suspend not just heterocentrism, but also suspend the sort of reassurances we tell ourselves about friendship, and about the way that we build relationships, right? It asks us to break down those barriers and to really queer them. And I think that is something that's really interesting and can really open our eyes, which kind of touches on something that Doty writes about a little bit in his Wizard of Oz question, in his Wizard of Oz reading. He apparently received an immense amount of pushback, for he does a lesbian reading of the Wizard of Oz, which I think would surprise a lot of people, because they're like, that's queer, like, that's for gay men, right? That's a gay man movie. But he's like, no. Lesbians. And he apparently received some pushback from straight feminist editors who said, you doing this reading is, hold on. This is the best part of the book. I was tweeting about how mad this made me, and he's so mad about it. Okay. So after reading a draft of this essay, a feminist academic, speaking for herself as well as for a group of editors, was concerned that I, quote, did not acknowledge that this is an appropriative reading, a move from a woman-centered film to a lesbian-centered film. What? What does that mean? What does that mean? And he, I mean, is rightfully, right, outraged about that, because, yeah, he's so mad about the question of appropriation here. Yeah, right, Rourke? What the fuck? I needed to wait for that to really hit the chat, because it's so fucking wild. Which leads to, because I think that's a question that happens all the time. Oh, lesbians can be women. Our current model of lesbianism says that they have to be women, which is not a model I agree with or love, but that's where we're at. He goes on to say, in his sort of rage, it's so good, I don't see the process of queer interpretation as an act of, quote, taking text from anyone. Just because straight interpretations have been allowed to flourish publicly doesn't mean they are the most true or real ones. And then he goes on to say, I think I'll address this kind of straight anger by suggesting that any offended straights address the heterocentrism, and yes, sometimes the homophobia, that is at the heart of much of the incomprehension, defensiveness, or shock they register in the face of gay, lesbian, and queer readings of pop culture. Which is so super, like, yes! Because, right, it's not replacing anything. The danger that queer folks posit heterosexuality by existing, and then by insisting that we consider the world in ways that are more comfortable, more valid, more interesting to us, is so real sometimes. And I think we forget that because we're in these bubbles, right? I specifically cultivate relationships that are friendly to the kinds of readings I do. And I think that that is really, it's easy for me to forget that that's not true. And when I'm faced with it in the quote-unquote real world, or the world outside my bubble, I'm like, oh, no. Rourke, I also agree. You know, I agree with you. I just have a lot of feelings, and we'll talk about that maybe when we talk about the contours of bisexuality and where it overlaps with other things. Maybe. We'll see. So yeah, it's just such a good read, and it's a really good reminder that the kinds of practices that we engage in as queer people, or as straight people doing queer readings, right? Because that's queer. Reading a straight book, or reading as a straight person, reading a film queerly is a queer act. You don't have to be queer to do queer readings. I would encourage you to do a lot of practice as a straight person, and as a queer person. I think that we get better at doing readings with practice, and the more we can destabilize heterocentrism in our lives, I think the better off we will be. Not just because it will make life better for queer people, but I think because it opens us up to those queer erotics that give us more space for certain kinds of relationships to exist in our lives that we might not otherwise let in. I've been thinking a lot about male intimacy, reading this book and doing other things. The movie where it was said it was appropriative was The Wizard of Oz, Rourke. He does, I'm going to try to explain, I think I will have time at the end of this to explain his reading of Wizard of Oz, because it's book wild, but really good. Yeah. Oh, one other thing I want to note that will help you with queer readings, and hopefully I will get to write an episode, or do an episode about this, is camp. Camp is something that is a part of queer culture that is so hard to describe, and that I do need an entire episode to talk about it, if not more than one episode, because I think there are a lot of divergent readings of camp that can make it really hard to parse. And so I want to bring those together for you, and we can talk about those divergent readings and talk about what is camp and in what ways is it helping. Yeah, camp is super hard work, so I'm going to do an episode on camp, maybe not next time, well, not next time for sure, but maybe sometime in June or July. Maybe someday we'll get to real history, but camp is also important, so yeah, no, Rourke, we will definitely do camp, because I have to study camp anyway to rewatch John Wick, but, yeah. He talks about it here, I'm going to draw from camp, and he has a huge footnote about it, so if you're really interested, you can check this out from your local university library, probably, and figure that one out. So yeah, are there any questions about reading skills that I mentioned, or things you want to talk a little more about? Heterocentrism, ways of reading queerness that go beyond insisting characters are gay because it's an option in the world. Any questions about things I read queerly, which I kind of talked about already, but real history is fake, Rourke. That's what it is. It's fake. This is a historical text because it's from almost 20 years ago, which in the world of scholarship is like 100 years. So I just gave you a history lesson as to what life was like in 2000 for queer people. Because if there are no questions, we can talk about the bananas Wizard of Oz reading. Yeah, I figured you would want to get their work. Okay, so his reading of the Wizard of Oz is that Dorothy is a baby dyke. And you're like, okay, I guess that makes sense in a world where you just say things about people. But his reading of Dorothy as a baby dyke has to do with his concurrent reading of the Wicked Witch of the West being a butch lesbian and Glinda being a femme lesbian. Yeah, Rourke, already you're like, I thought I knew where this one was going, but I don't. So, I'm doing this from memory because I wanted to, but it's so bananas. So, part of it is also rooted in Dorothy's relationship with Auntie M and the ways in which her desires for Auntie M are sort of queerly erotically charged. This is the question about motherhood that that comes up in the book. She's right. Auntie M is not the mother, but she's the mother figure, and she is someone that Dorothy is really drawn to. And honestly, I think that if Alexander Doty had lived, that book I talked about, Just Queer Folks, which is about queer folks in rural settings, not in the urban, has a whole beautifully amazing reading of what the author, whose name I wish I could remember, I'm just glancing behind the curtain to see if I can find it. Colin Johnson is his name. Colin Johnson. Colin Johnson refers to rural women as hard women. And he reads the hard woman as a queer figure because she performs femininity in a way that is not recognized by mainstream culture. Like hard women, like, because their lives are hard, and the ways in which they perform their lives and perform their genders are hard. I'm doing a really bad explanation, so if you're interested, I will try to dig up and talk more about maybe hard women at another time. Oh yeah, I know about Train Story. It's a great game. It has an aunt in it who you can read queerly. So anyway, the shoes, right, are this, and here Doty is weirdly not specific about the way that he's using fetish and fetish object. I'm unclear what he means because my reading of fetish is really limited. Whoever thought you'd live to say that? But, right, it also has to do with the figure of the witch. And the witch, right, is one that is historically very often, particularly in European communities, connected with lesbianism, and has been a big figure also in a reclaiming of queer history for lesbianism. I'm trying to think who wrote that classical text about lesbians. I can't remember. But, anyway, Dorothy comes down and refuses to recognize to recognize Glinda, right, this femme figure, as a witch, because all visible lesbians are also butch. Hashtag living the life. And so basically it is about Doty's reading of this lesbian journey for Dorothy is about the push-pull dynamic between the good femme that Dorothy could become or the evil butch dyke that she could become, represented in these two figures of Glinda and the Wicked Witch. And that is just buck wild and so interesting, and I'm doing a very bad job of explaining it. It makes some sense on page, and then I leave it, and I'm like, what the fuck? What the fuck? And he brings together all these different readings that other people have done, and also, like, changes to the text. So, in one version of the Wizard of Oz script, the Wicked Witch has a son whose name is, this is not a joke, Bulbo. And they got rid of the character of Bulbo, right? So they removed the son figure from the Wicked Witch to make her, it's not explicitly to, like, make her less heterosexual, but it moves her farther away from heterosexuality. Yeah, Rourke, I was thinking the same thing about Wicked, about how to do a queer reading, because I think that is already, right, Wicked is written by a queer man. Ooh, the timeline of Wicked is really interesting. I don't know the date of Wicked off the top of my head, but Gregory Maguire, right, is himself, I think, a gay man, and there are certainly queer things going on in that book. The whole bestiality sequence, which, you know, in the light of Gail Rubin, that's fine, I guess. But it's just this really wild reading, and you learn a lot about, what's the part about, I want to remember about the fetish objects. Let me see if I can find it. Here's the fetish objects. There's something about those shoes as something that protect her from the butch. There's so much going on, Rourke. This chapter is just wild. Oh yeah, also, he's reading The Connection. I don't know if you've heard of this understanding of the Wizard of Oz, where Glinda is actually Auntie M, and, what's her name? Gulch? Almira Gulch is her first name. The woman who threatens to have Toto killed, is, it's played by the same actress who plays the Wicked Witch of the West, so if you're supposed to be reading those as some kind of doubling, I mean, I think you're actually supposed to be reading those as doubling. I don't know. I don't study film. But talking about, right, the spinster as lesbian in that situation. Oh my god, here we go. This is just I'm just going to read you quotations now because it's so funny. He's talking about the vortex, the tornado. He goes, and all of this happens deep within a swirling vortex of a cyclone, which becomes, in this context, a rather outrageously heavy-handed symbolic representation of the classic dangerous butch stereotype. They possess and desire female genitalia, the vortex, while identifying with heterosexual, quote, phallic, masculinity, how the cyclone externally takes the shape of a funnel. Alex, what are you doing? It's so wild. I mean, it's not wild, that just makes me laugh. And that's part of it for me. Oh, Psycho, you want to talk about Psycho, Rourke? Okay. Psycho, from my understanding, what was this? What did I mark for here? Oh, queer friendship. He's engaging specifically with the fights that happened, particularly after Silence of the Lamb came out. I think there was a lot of queer reading done, or a lot of readings done also of Psycho, because in Silence of the Lambs, they have cyclos are penises, but they also have vaginas, Rourke. It's both. They're a trans object. No. So in Psycho, it's the battle over whether or not Norman Bates is gay. And Dodie sort of enters that argument and says it's queer. It's queer in a way that defies explanation. And so his engagement has to do with balancing the sort of ways of reading Norman Bates as gay alongside with reading him as straight, but sort of maladjusted. Reading, like the obvious Norman Bates is a mama's boy. Norman Bates is like a transvestite or transgender, who knows? And he is saying that it is in fact our inability to categorize those, cyclones are intersex, to categorize Norman Bates that's so disturbing to us about him. And actually he ends up, maybe you would know this person, Rourke, because I've never seen Psycho, although, weirdly, after reading this, I want to watch it. Which I think speaks loads of how interesting this reading is. No worries, Rourke, we're wrapping up. But he also reads Lila Crane as a lesbian, which is really interesting. And so it's all just a very fascinating book and a fascinating read. And I really encourage you to go out and do readings of your own, to read this book if you can get a hold of it. It's really interesting. And to fight heterocentrism in your own life, because it will make your life more fun and better, and it'll make movies interesting again, because they're boring now. Heterosexuality is boring. Just kidding. It's fine. So, thanks so much for watching. Thanks, Rourke, for engaging in the chat. Next week, I'm going to be back here, same time, hopefully, and we're going to talk about Bruce Springsteen, which you also know is a delight of mine, a big joy. I love to talk about Bruce. So thank you so much for hanging and for listening to me just talk about this book that I liked that was really interesting. If you have any questions, you can reach me on Twitter at yetregressing, or just generally. It's fun. So thank you for coming. Super hype about fisting bottoms. Always. Bye.